The locker beside mine slammed open before I even finished lacing my boots. "What is that?" I didn't look up right away. I knew the voice. Cadet Vreth, top-ranked first year, 6 limbs, 4 opinions, and 0 patience for anything he couldn't immediately categorize. I finished the second knot on my boot, stood straight and turned to face him. In my hands was a bundle wrapped in old brown leather, tied with a cord that had frayed at one end. It wasn't large, it wasn't glowing, it didn't hum or pulse or project a targeting grid. It was just a bundle, worn smooth at the edges from years of hands holding it exactly where my hands were holding it now. "My gear," I said. He reached out one of his middle limbs, the slender ones he used for fine work, and pointed at it. "That is not gear. That is a wrapped object. What is inside it?" I set it on my bunk and unwrapped it slowly. The leather fell away in 2 folds, the cord I coiled and tucked into my kit bag, and then Kurotori was lying there on my gray academy blanket, in the cold white light of Barrack 7 on Station 8 and 7, looking exactly like what it was, a sword. A real one, old steel, a long curved single edge, a grip wrapped in faded black cord, a small brass guard, and on the flat of the blade near the base, 2 lines of kanji etched so fine you had to look twice to see them. There was also a small crest just above the kanji, a bird in flight, wings spread, done in a style so old it almost looked more like calligraphy than metalwork, a crane, a black one. Vreth stared at it, then he made a sound. I had learned enough Keth vocal cues in the past 3 weeks to recognize it. It was laughter. "That is a non-powered cutting tool," he said, and his translator rendered his words flat and precise the way it always did, but the amusement underneath came through perfectly. "From Earth. Pre-technological. You brought a pre-technological cutting tool to the Interstellar Union Military Academy." I picked up my issued pulse blade with my other hand and slid it into its hip housing. Then I wrapped Kurotori carefully back in its leather, tied the cord, and tucked it under my arm. "I brought 2 blades," I said, "the one I was issued and the one I chose." He called over to the others. "I want to be clear about that." He did not whisper it to one friend and let it spread quietly. He called it out loud, to the whole barracks, where 42 cadets from 11 different species were in various stages of getting their morning gear sorted. He called it out the way you do when you have already decided something is funny and you want witnesses. "The human brought a museum piece," he said. "A pre-technological earth-cutting tool, no power cell, no edge enhancement, no targeting assisted, just metal." Some of them laughed. A few looked over with the blank curiosity of species who processed humor differently, but understood that something social was happening. Cadet Desh, Adar, tall and smooth-skinned with 4 dark eyes, walked over and looked at the bundle under my arm with what I could only describe as polite. "Confusion a weapon?" she asked me directly. "Yes," I said. "It functions without power?" "Yes." She seemed to turn that over for a moment. Then she went back to her bunk. Not dismissive, just done with the data collection portion of the interaction. The laughter faded on its own after a minute. People had things to do. Morning drill started in 20. I stowed Kurotori in my footlocker, placed her flat, leather still wrapped, and locked it. The locker made a soft click. I stood there for just a second with my hand on the top of it. My grandmother had given it to me the morning I left for the selection process. Not the night before, not at dinner with the whole family, not with a speech. She had come to my room at 5 in the morning while it was still dark outside, set the bundle on my desk without a word, and then sat in my chair and watched me open it. I had seen it before, of course. It lived in a case in her study, but I had only ever seen it through glass. That morning was the first time I held it. It was heavier than it looked and lighter than I expected, which made no sense until I realized the weight was not just physical. She had told me 2 things and nothing else. She said, "It is older than our family name," she said. "It is a responsibility, not a decoration." Then she kissed my forehead and left the room. I found out later, from my mother, that my grandmother had carried it in the field, that she had been in some kind of military action before I was born, before my mother was even old enough to ask questions. She had never talked about it. She had simply kept the sword, kept it clean, kept it sharp, and eventually given it to me. I did not fully understand why she had given it to me, and not my mother or my older brother. I was not the strongest or the most naturally gifted fighter in my family. I was not especially remarkable in any way that made sense as a reason to receive something like this. But I had it, and I had brought it here, and now 30-something alien cadets knew about it, and most of them thought it was a joke. I went to morning drill. We ran the gravity course for 40 minutes, recited tactical formations in 3 languages, and then stood in assessment lines while Sub-Commander Pellis, a veil with the kind of face that had stopped showing emotion sometime around the 2nd century of his life, walked the line and noted who was where on every metric. He stopped in front of me for slightly longer than he stopped in front of anyone else. He did not say anything. He looked at my file on his handheld, looked at my face, looked back at the file, and moved on. I had scores in the acceptable range, not the top range, not the range that made instructors stop and comment. Just acceptable. I was one of 11 humans in a class of over 400. The Union had admitted humans as a courtesy 6 years ago when Earth signed the membership compact. 6 years was not very long. Most of the species in that drill line had been Union members for decades or centuries. They had frameworks for understanding what a soldier was, what skill looked like, what potential looked like. Humans did not fit neatly into any of those frameworks. What that meant in practice was this: we were not expected to excel. We were expected to manage, to keep up well enough, to not embarrass the diplomatic relationship that had gotten us here. I had heard one of the senior cadets, a Marath with silver-banded arms, describe Earth's Union membership as a gesture of goodwill toward a promising but unfinished species. I had smiled when I heard that and said nothing. Grandmother always said, "Let them think the blade is dull. That is when it is most dangerous." After drill, we had a free period before tactical theory. I went back to the barracks alone, unlocked my footlocker, and sat on my bunk with Kurotori across my knees. I unwrapped her slowly. The light in the barracks was better now. Midday light from the station's artificial sun cycle, and the blade caught it in a long pale line. She was not just any sword. I had done enough research before leaving Earth to understand that. The kanji on the blade translated roughly as, made to endure. The style of forging was a tradition that went back over 1,000 years on Earth, a process so specific and so demanding that the people who did it had been considered artists as much as craftspeople. The chrysanthemum crest above the kanji was an older marking still, the kind used by certain families and certain units during certain periods of Japanese history that my grandmother had never explained to me. I ran my thumb along the spine of the blade, not the edge. The edge was real and sharp enough to cut without any enhancement at all. The sense was smooth and slightly warm from sitting in the locked locker, as though it had been waiting. I had a feeling, sitting there, that I could not explain, and would not have tried to explain out loud to anyone in that barracks. It was not mystical. I am not a mystical person. It was more like standing at the edge of something large and not yet knowing what it was. I wrapped her back up, tucked her away, locked the locker, tactical theory in 4 minutes. I picked up my study pad, straightened my collar, and walked out. Behind me, the locker sat silent in the row. Something in my chest said not yet, but soon. The sparring hall was the loudest place on 8th and 7 when it was full, and the quietest place when it went still. It went still the morning Vreth called me out in front of everyone. We were 2 weeks into live combat drills. The rules were simple enough. Each cadet fought in the style of their species' tradition, using their traditional weapon alongside or instead of issued tech. The thinking behind it was Union philosophy in practical form. The Union did not want soldiers who only knew one way to win. It wanted soldiers who understood that every species had developed its own answer to the same problem, and that those answers, taken together, made something stronger than any one of them alone. What that meant on the floor of the sparring hall was this: Vreth fought with his dual monofilament whips, coiled carbon thread weapons that moved so fast they looked like light. Cadet Dash fought with a curved staff that stored kinetic force and released it in pulses. The Marath cadets fought with their banded arms, and a form of grappling so precise it looked more like engineering than combat. Each of them was extraordinary in the way their tradition had made them extraordinary. And I walked onto the floor with Kurotori on my hip and my issued pulse blade in its housing. The laughter started before I even reached the center line. It was not cruel exactly. Cruelty implies intent, and most of them were not trying to be mean. They were genuinely amused, the way you are amused when something unexpected happens, and the unexpectedness is funny before it is anything else. A non-powered blade in a room full of energy weapons, carbon thread whips, and kinetic staves was objectively unusual. Vreth stood at the far end of the floor when I arrived. He had not called me out personally this time. The drill rotation had simply landed us opposite each other. But he looked across the floor at me, at Kurotori on my hip, and he made that sound again. The laughter sound. "The old cutting tool comes to the sparring floor," he said, not loudly. But the hall's acoustics carried everything. More laughter, scattered, mostly from the Keth cadets, who had a sharp social instinct for following Vreth's lead. Sub-Commander Pella stood at the side of the floor with his hands behind his back and his face doing nothing at all. He did not intervene. He did not react. He watched. I stepped to the center line. The floor was a pale material that absorbed impact and gave it back at the ankles. I had trained on floors like it every day for 2 weeks and I still did not love the feeling of it underfoot. I planted anyway, adjusted my stance, breathed once, deep and slow. Vreth took his position across from me. His 6 limbs moved with the easy confidence of someone who had been at the top of every ranking since the day he arrived. He was not wrong to be confident. He was fast, he was precise, and he had nearly perfect proprioception. His 2 upper limbs held the grips of his whips. His lower limbs anchored him with a spread that made him look like a living fortification. The start tone sounded. He moved first. The first whip came in a horizontal arc at shoulder height, and I ducked under it, which was what he expected. The second came low while I was still dropping and caught me across the shin with the flat, not the edge. He was set to non-lethal force for the drill. It still felt like being hit with a fast-moving rod. I stumbled, caught myself, put 3 steps between us. The cadets watching made a collective noise, not quite a cheer, more like a sharp exhale. Vreth reset his position. He had not moved far, he did not need to. His range with those whips was enormous and he knew it. He came again. This time both whips together, staggered by a fraction of a second, so that blocking one would open me up to the other. It was a technique I had watched him use 4 times in previous matches and I had studied it. Not because I had known I would face him. Because I studied everyone. Grandmother had taught me that too. She said, watch first, always watch first. What a person repeats is what they believe in. What they believe in is where they stop thinking. He believed in the stagger. He used it because it worked, and it had always worked. And he had never needed to think about what happened when it did not work. I did not try to block both. I went inside. It sounds simple when you say it like that. It was not simple. Going inside the arc of a dual whip fighter meant closing distance fast, which meant eating the outer edge of at least one strike, which I did. It caught me on the left forearm, and it was not pleasant. But I was inside his effective range now, too close for him to use the whips at full extension, and I had Kuratori's flat against both of his grip limbs at the wrist joint, pinning them down and inward. He could not release the tension in the whips from that angle. They went slack. I held the position for 2 full seconds. The hall was completely silent. The tone sounded end of round. Points to me. I stepped back. Vreth stared at me. His grip limbs were still in the position I had left them, held slightly out and down, the whips hanging loose. He looked at Kuratori. He looked at me. He looked at Kuratori again. That movement, he said. His translator rendered it flat, but I heard the undercurrent. It is not in any combat database I have studied. No, I said. I kept my voice easy. It is about 400 years older than your databases. Another silence. Longer this time. Then Desh spoke from the side of the floor. She had been watching with the same careful attention she brought to everything. The technique used the blade as a binding tool, not a cutting tool. That is a different weapon philosophy. Yes, I said. Your tradition developed that specifically? My tradition had a long time to think about what to do when the other person is faster than you. Pellis made a note on his handheld. He did not look up. He just noted it and moved on to the next pair on the rotation schedule. Vreth coiled his whip slowly. He did not say anything else that morning. But he did not make the laughter sound either. The rest of the drill period passed the way it always did, full and fast and loud. But something in the hall was different after that match, and everyone in it knew it. It was not that I had won. Cadets won and lost every day in that hall. It was what I had won with, an old blade and a technique 4 centuries out of any database. Fought inside when I should have run, pinned when I should have blocked, and finished a round against the highest-ranked first year in the cohort. Afterward, in the corridor outside the hall, I heard one of the dark cadets say something quietly to the one beside him. I caught only the last part of it because my dar was still rough. But I caught enough. He said humans are strange. They carry broken things and turn them into weapons. I thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. He was not wrong exactly, but he was not quite right either. Kuratori was not broken. She had never been broken. She had just been waiting for someone to stop assuming she was. That evening in the barracks, nobody made any sounds when I set her on my bunk. Vreth was at his own bunk, cleaning his whips, and he did not call over to the room. Nobody made any comment at all. I unwrapped her, checked the edge the way my grandmother had shown me, checked the cord on the grip, checked the crest. The crane looked back at me from the steel, wings spread and still. I wrapped her up, locked her away, climbed into my bunk. In the dark, I stared at the ceiling of the barracks and thought about what 400 years looked like from the outside, a museum piece, a relic, something out of date and out of place. Then I thought about Vreth's face when the whips went slack. Out of place maybe, out of date no. A relic is just a thing that survived everything meant to destroy it. The new instructor arrived on a Tuesday. We knew someone was coming because Pellis had told us during the previous day's tactical theory session to have our gear clean, our barracks in order, and our weapon histories ready to present. Weapon histories were something the senior cadets had told us about. It was a VL tradition, apparently, one the Academy had adopted and kept for decades. The idea was that a soldier's weapon tells you who they are and where they came from, not just the spec and the power output, the actual history, where it was made, who made it, who carried it before you, what it had been through. The Veil believed that understanding what your weapon had survived told you something true about what you yourself were capable of surviving. Most cadets had prepared short statements. Species that had been in the Union a long time had deep weapon lineages to draw on, clan histories, regimental traditions, founding war stories. The Keth, the Dar, the Marath, even the younger members like the Solith and the Preth, all of them had something to say. Vreth had spent 2 evenings the week before going over his family's whipcraft lineage, which apparently went back 7 generations and included a name in one of the Union's early founding engagements. I had one sword and a grandmother who had not explained anything. I spent the night before looking at what I did know. The forging tradition, the kanji, the crest. I found references to the chrysanthemum and crane mark in old Earth records, but the records were incomplete, fragmented the way old records always are, when they have been digitized from physical documents that were already damaged. I found the name of a unit that had used that mark. I found dates. I found a reference to an action in a place I did not recognize, a corridor designation in a battle I had not heard of. It was not enough to build a history. It was enough to know the history existed. The new instructor walked into the main assembly hall at 0900. I heard the change in the room before I saw him. Not a sound exactly. More like a shift in pressure, the way the air feels different when a door opens into a space that has been closed for a long time. A collective stillness. And then he was at the front of the room and I could see why. Commander Oris was Vale. That alone would have been enough to make the room quiet. The Vale were the Union's founding military species, the ones who had built the original framework of organized interstellar defense, the ones whose traditions formed the backbone of everything the Academy taught. They were long-lived, deeply experienced, and they carried themselves with a particular stillness of people who had seen enough history that they were no longer surprised by it. Oris was tall, close to 7 feet, with the pale iridescent skin of his species, the kind that shifted between silver and faint blue depending on the angle of light. His eyes were dark, almost fully black, and they moved across the room slowly, not surveying, not assessing in the quick ticking way Pellis assessed. More like reading. Like the room was a text, and he was in no hurry to finish it. He stood at the front without speaking for long enough that 3 cadets shifted in their seats. He did not react to the movement. He simply waited until the room was fully still again, and then he said, in a voice that was low and even and completely clear, "You will each bring your weapon forward. You will stand with it and tell me its name, its origin, and one thing it has endured. If you do not know the answer to any of those, you will say so. Saying you do not know is not a failure. Knowing something false and presenting it as true is." He sat then on the raised bench at the front and waited. We went in rotation order. Vreth went early, number 6 in the line, and presented his whips with precision and confidence. 7 generations of lineage, a founding war name, the correct Keth forms. Oris listened without expression and nodded once at the end. Desh went and described her staff's origin in a craftwork tradition that predated Dar Union membership. Oris nodded again, one by one. I counted down to my own number. When I reached the front of the room, I was carrying Kurotori in her leather wrap under my arm. I set her on the presentation surface at the front of the room, the flat table all cadets used for gear display, and I unwrapped her slowly the same way I always did. The leather fell away. The cord coiled at the edge. Kurotori lay there in the light of the assembly hall, steel and cord and brass and that small etched crest, and I opened my mouth to begin the few things I knew. I did not get through the first sentence. Oris stood up. Not abruptly, not urgently, but he stood, and when a Veil commander stands in the middle of a presentation, it is not a small thing. The room noticed immediately. I heard the quality of the silence change. Oris walked to the front of the table, and he looked at Kurotori, not at me, at the blade. He did not touch it. He leaned forward slightly and looked at the crest. He looked at the kanji. He straightened, and then he bowed. It was a full Veil warbow. I knew the form from our cultural protocol classes, head inclined, both hands open at the sides, held for 3 full seconds before rising. It was not a greeting bow or a courtesy bow. It was the bow you gave to something that had earned permanent acknowledgement. Something whose history placed it beyond ordinary respect. He gave it to my grandmother's sword. The room was so quiet I could hear the environmental recyclers in the ceiling. He straightened and looked at me. His black eyes were steady and completely unreadable. That blade has history, he said it so quietly. Not for the room. Or maybe for the room and for me equally. His voice did not waver. His expression did not change. But there was something in those words that was not instructional or ceremonial. It was personal. It was the voice of someone saying a thing they had needed to say for a long time, and had only now been given the opportunity. I stood very still. Tell me your name, he said. Cadet Sarah Voss, and the blade's name, Kurotori, it means black crane. Something moved through his expression. Not much. Just the smallest shift, the way water shifts when something beneath the surface moves. He looked at the crest again. The bird in flight, wings spread, done in that old calligraphic style. I know this mark, he said. He said it to me, not to the room, even though the room was there. I have known it for a long time. I did not know what to say to that. I said nothing. He turned to face the room. We will continue the presentations. His voice was entirely level. He sat back down. I wrapped Kurotori, tucked her under my arm, walked back to my seat. My legs were steady. My hands were steady. But something in my chest was moving, turning over, trying to find its footing, because I had just watched a 3-century-old Vale commander bow to a sword that my grandmother had carried and never once explained to me, and I still did not know why. After the session ended, most cadets filed out toward the midday period. I stayed back. I was rewrapping the cord on the leather bundle, taking my time with it, when Aura spoke from the front of the room. Cadet Voss. I looked up. He was standing at the front table, his hands behind his back. The hall was otherwise empty. The mark on that blade, he said. The unit designation. Do you know which action they served in? I found a reference to something, I said. A corridor designation. I could not find the full record. The Unification Skirmish, he said. 2241. A transit corridor on the outer ring of what is now Station Wreath 9. Before it was a station, when it was still a partially built relay outpost. Does that mean anything to you? I shook my head. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, It means something to me. I was there. I was not a soldier then. I was younger than you are now. There were 3,000 Vale civilians being evacuated through that corridor when the passage tech failed. The corridor was the only remaining exit point, and it had to be held long enough for the evacuation to complete. He paused. I held very still. A unit of 6 human soldiers held that corridor for 11 hours, he said. They had no powered weapons by the 3rd hour. Power cells failed in the interference field from the structural collapse. They held it anyway. With edged weapons, with physical technique, with the specific and extraordinary stubbornness that I have come to associate with your species when it is at its most itself. He looked at the bundle in my hands. The unit designation on their patches was a bird, a black crane. I did not know the soldier who carried that blade specifically. There were 6 of them and they rotated positions. But the blade was there. I saw it more than once. And 11 hours later, when the last evacuation transport cleared the corridor, all 3,000 of us were alive. The hall hummed quietly around us. The recyclers in the ceiling. The faint vibration of the station's drive system somewhere far below. My grandmother, I said. My voice came out quieter than I intended. She was in a unit before I was born. She never talked about it. We knew she had served, but she never said where or what happened. Oris inclined his head slightly. The soldier who carried that blade called herself Kurotori. On her unit patch, that was her designation. We never learned her given name, I said. Her name was Hannah. He was quiet for a moment, just quiet. Then he said, with more gentleness than I had heard in his voice since he arrived. Then you are carrying her name as well as her blade, Cadet Voss. Both of them have a history worth knowing. He left the hall. I stood there alone with Kurotori in my hands, the leather warm under my fingers. And for the first time since my grandmother had handed this to me in the dark of an early morning, I understood the weight of it. Not the metal, the meaning. I called home that night from the communications room on sublevel 2, the one with the small booths that gave you actual privacy instead of the open bay terminals in the barracks. My mother answered on the 3rd signal. Her face came up on the screen tired and happy the way it always was at that hour on Earth. Mid-morning for her, late in my cycle. She saw my face and her expression shifted immediately. What happened, she said. Nothing bad, I said. I need to ask you something about grandmother. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, How much do you want to know? That told me everything about how much there was to know. If the answer were simple, she would have just said it. You ask how much when the answer has layers and you want to know where to start. All of it, I said. She took a breath. She poured herself tea off screen. She came back and held the cup in both hands the way she always did when she was settling in for something serious. She told me what she knew. It was not everything. Grandmother Hannah had not told her everything either, only pieces. But the pieces added up to this. Hannah Voss had been in the 14th Mobile Irregular Unit. They had served during the period that preceded Earth's formal contact with the Interstellar Union, a period that Earth's official records called the Unification Preparatory Years, and that the Union's records called something Ores had named. This morning, the Unification Skirmish of 2241. The unit had been small, 6 people. They had operated in environments where standard technology was unreliable, which was why they trained with and carried non-powered weapons as a matter of course, not as a backup, not as a tradition, but as a practical necessity. Kuratori had not been ceremonial in Hana's hands. She had carried it because in the places she went, it was the tool that would not fail when everything else did. My mother said, "Your grandmother never talked about the corridor specifically. She talked around it once. Years ago, she said that there were people on the other side of that corridor who needed time, and that time was the one thing she could give them." My mother had not known who the people were. She had not pressed. Hannah did not press back on things like that. I told my mother what Oris had told me, about the 3,000 veil, about the 11 hours, about the evacuation completing. My mother did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, "She never told us. She never said a word about any of it." "I know," I said. "She just cleaned that sword every Sunday and put it back in the case." "I know." We sat with that for a moment, the two of us on opposite ends of an interstellar link, separated by light minutes and a gulf of things Hannah Voss had chosen to carry quietly. Then my mother said, in a voice that was trying very hard to be steady, "I am glad you took it with you." After the call, I walked back to the barracks slowly. The corridors of 8th and 7 were quieter at this hour, the day shift cadets in their bunks, the skeleton crew of station staff moving on their own errands at their own pace. I walked past the sparring hall, past the tactical theory rooms, past the equipment bay, and I thought about what a person does with something like this. I had arrived at this academy carrying Kurotori under my arm and a name nobody recognized, and a record that said acceptable range. I had expected to keep my head down and prove myself slowly and maybe, eventually, earn the right to be taken seriously. I had not expected to be carrying proof of something this large. I was not sure I wanted to be. That was the honest thought, the one that came before the more composed ones. I had not done anything at 2241. I had not been born yet. My grandmother had held that corridor, not me. The history in that blade was hers, not mine, and I was aware, walking those corridors, that I was being looked at differently now because of something someone else had done and never told anyone about. It felt complicated. It felt like standing in borrowed light. When I reached the barracks, Vreth was still awake. He was at his bunk doing maintenance on his whip grips, which was something he did every few days with the methodical care of someone who genuinely respected his equipment. He looked up when I came in. He did not say anything at first. Then he set down the grip he was working on and brought all 6 limb tips together in front of his chest, held them there for 3 seconds, and lowered them. I recognized the gesture. We had covered it in cultural protocol. It was the Keth formal acknowledgement of respect, the kind given between equals, not the dismissive tap that served as a casual greeting. He had never done it in my direction before. I nodded to him. He nodded back. He picked up the grip again and went back to his work. I sat on my bunk. I did not unwrap Kurotori. I just held the bundle in my lap for a while. The thing I could not stop thinking about was not the history. It was the choice. My grandmother had chosen to give this to me specifically, on a morning before I left for something she must have known would matter. She had not explained. She had handed it over and said 2 things. It is older than our family name, and it is a responsibility, not a decoration. She had known the full weight of it. She had chosen not to hand me the weight along with the blade. She had let me carry it into the world and find the weight on my own terms, in my own time, in the place where it would make the most sense. I thought about that a lot over the next 2 days, about how you give a person something that important, about what it means to trust someone with a thing you could have kept for yourself, about what Hannah Voss had decided when she looked at me across the breakfast table, or in the hallway, or wherever she had made this decision, and thought, this one gets it. Oris called me to his office at the end of the 2nd day. It was a small office sparse in the Vale way, which meant functional without ornamentation. 1 desk, 1 terminal, 2 chairs, a small rack on the wall holding 3 items that I recognized as ceremonial in a Vale context, old items, displayed in the specific way the Vale displayed things that mattered. He told me to sit. I sat. The other cadets have been informed of the general history, he said. Not by me. I said nothing after the presentation hall. But in a community this size, information moves. I know, I said. I noticed. How are you handling that? The question surprised me. It was not a question I had expected from him. He waited for me to think about it, which I appreciated. Carefully, I said, finally. He accepted that. The history connected to that blade places you in a visible position, he said. You came here as a human cadet in an academy where humans are new and where many species are still deciding what to make of you. You were already visible in that way. Now you are visible in a second way. As a symbol, I said, yes. Earth's involvement in the unification period is not widely known outside Vale historical records. The 14th Mobile Irregular Unit's action at the corridor was never entered into Union official history, because at that time Earth was not a Union member and the diplomacy surrounding first contact was still extremely delicate. The credit was absorbed into a general record. The humans involved were never named. I felt something go tight in my chest. So nobody knows, I said. Many people will know now, he said, because you are here with that blade, and I bowed to it in front of 400 cadets. That information will not stay inside this academy. I made a choice this morning, Cadet Voss. I want you to understand that. I could have addressed you privately. I chose not to. I looked at him. His black eyes were direct and patient. Why? I said. Because the 14th Mobile Irregular Unit held that corridor and saved 3,000 lives and was never acknowledged. Your grandmother cleaned a sword every Sunday and put it back in its case and never said a word to anyone. That is its own form of discipline and dignity. But there is a point at which silence becomes something else. History has a right to be known. I sat with that. Then he said, there is also a practical reason. Earth's position in the Union is contested. Not violently, but politically. There are species who view your membership as premature and your species as insufficiently developed for full standing. Evidence that humans contributed meaningfully to the Union's founding period, at great cost and without recognition, is not a small thing politically. I did not ask to be a political fact, I said. No, he said, but you are one. The question is whether you carry that the way your grandmother carried this blade, quietly and well. I thought about Hannah Voss on a Sunday morning, running a cloth along steel that no one would ask about. I thought about responsibility and decoration. I thought about what it meant to carry something not for credit, but because it needed carrying. I understand, I said. He nodded. One more thing. There is a veil concept I want to give you. It is called Kethvera. It means, the blade chooses its carrier. In our tradition, a weapon that has passed through history arrives where it needs to be. Your grandmother did not choose randomly. She looked at you, and she made a decision about what you were capable of. That decision is itself part of the blade's history now. I left his office in the early evening with Kuratori under my arm and more things in my head than I knew how to sort. But somewhere inside the unsorted weight of it, something had settled. Something quiet and solid, the way steel is solid when it has been properly made. Not heavy for nothing, heavy because it was real. The emergency tone sounded on a morning that had started completely without drama. We were 3 days into the final assessment cycle, the series of exercises that would determine first-year standings and initial specialization assignments. The morning block was a combined exercise, tactical movement and sparring, staged in the outer ring of 8th and 7 where the corridors were wider and the environmental systems were built for training use. I was suited up Kuratori on my hip for the sparring portion of the exercise, issued pulse blade in its housing. 12 cadets in the outer ring group, myself included, working through the movement phase, clearing room sequences, relaying position data. Standard exercise, the kind we had run 8 times before. Then the lights went to emergency red and the tone hit. Not a drill tone. I knew the drill tone. This was different in pitch and rhythm. The emergency pattern we had been taught to recognize and told, straightforwardly, that we would probably never hear for real during our first year. The ceiling groaned. Not metaphorically. The actual structural material of the corridor, overhead, produced a sound I had never heard before and immediately understood completely. Something had failed. Something large. The environmental display on the corridor wall flickered and died. The main lights cut. Emergency strips along the floor kicked on, pale and blue, enough to see shapes and not much more. Then the bulkhead at the far end of the corridor closed, sealed, locked. The heavy kind. The structural emergency type that goes down when the system detects a breach and prioritizes compartmentalization. It was not subtle. It was a wall of metal, floor to ceiling, and it was between us and the way out. 12 cadets in a corridor with no power, sealed in. Emergency lighting only. For about 4 seconds, nobody said anything. Then 2 cadets started talking at once, not panicking but overlapping, and a third tried to open a wall terminal with their hands and found it blank and dark, and a fourth said something in Keth that my translator was not picking up, because my translator ran on the suit's secondary power, which had apparently not yet synced to emergency mode. Vreth was 6 feet from me. He looked at the sealed bulkhead. He looked at the dead terminal. He looked at me. I do not know exactly why he looked at me. Maybe it was the blade. Maybe it was the corridor. Maybe it was just that I was the nearest person whose face showed something other than confusion. I stepped to the center of the corridor and I said, clearly and at a volume that cut through the overlapping voices, "Stop. Listen. There's 12 cadets, 5 species, emergency lighting, sealed bulkhead, all of them looking at me. Everyone check your suit's emergency frequency. Manual toggle, left collar panel. Check for a signal." 6 of them reached for their collar panels. 3 were already trying. One of the Marith cadets reported a faint signal, enough to push a distress indicator but not enough for voice. I told him to push it. He did. "Good," I said. "Now air. We have recyclers in the walls and they run on the station's passive grid, not the active system. We are not in danger from air for at least 6 hours. Everybody breathe normally. I need you all calm." Someone asked how I knew about the passive grid. "I read the station system's manual during our first week," I said. I was bored. It got a sound from 2 cadets that was approximately laughter. Good. Laughter is air moving, and air moving means a person is breathing, and breathing means they are present. I moved to the bulkhead. It was a Type 4 emergency closure, which I knew because the manual had a diagram, and the number was stamped on the mechanism housing at the bottom right. Type 4 closures had a manual override for exactly this kind of situation. Power failure plus structural alert. The override was a mechanical system, independent of the station's power grid. Because the people who designed it understood that you cannot build a failsafe that depends on the same system it is meant to protect against. The override was a recessed latch behind a panel on the left side of the bulkhead frame. The panel required a specific tool to open, a flat pry point inserted at an angle and rotated. I looked at Kuratori on my hip. My grandmother had taught me that move on a camping trip when I was 11 years old, using a stuck ammunition crate that had swollen in the heat and would not open with the standard tool. She had shown me how to use the spine of the blade as a lever, inserted at exactly the right angle to create pressure without damaging either the blade or the thing being pried. She had said a good blade is not just for cutting, it is the right shape for many problems. I took Kuratori out of her carry position and drew her, holding the grip in both hands, blade angled down. Vreth made a sound that was not the laughter sound, it was something else. Attention maybe. Focus. I inserted the spine into the gap at the panel edge. The angle had to be specific and I took a moment to find it, feeling the resistance, adjusting. Then I rotated. The panel resisted for 2 seconds, 3, and then it popped open with a sound like a held breath releasing. Behind it was the mechanical latch. My hands were steady. I want to note that they were completely steady. I engaged the latch. It moved stiffly, the way mechanical systems do when they have not been used and were not designed to feel smooth. They were designed to be reliable. I put my weight into it. The latch turned. The bulkhead groaned and began to rise. Slowly, it was not fast. It went up on the mechanical system at about a third of the speed it would have moved on active power, rising in sections with the sound of metal working against metal. But it went up, and through the gap at the bottom and then through the widening space as it rose, I could see the corridor on the other side. Emergency strips. Another sealed section further on, but one closed by drill design, not by the emergency system, and it would open to a cadet code. 12 minutes since the tone had sounded at single file, Vreth, take the end of the line dash, second position behind me. Let's move. We moved. The corridor on the other side was clear. The cadet lock at the next section opened on the 3rd try when I used my academy code manually, on the mechanical pad. The corridor beyond it led to the central junction, which had partial power restored by the time we reached it. Emergency to primary handoff, the lights coming back up from blue to white. At the central junction, 3 station engineers in emergency gear were running toward us from the far end. Behind them, walking at a pace that was not a run but covered ground very quickly, was Commander Oris. He reached us as the engineers began checking the cadets over, scanning for injuries. No one was hurt. Vreth had a bruised shin from where he had moved too fast in the dark and caught a wall edge. That was the entirety of the damage report. Oris looked at me. He looked at Kuratori, still drawn in my hand. I cleaned the spine on the inside of my sleeve, an automatic gesture, the way my grandmother had shown me, and slid her back into carry position. What happened? Oris said. I gave him the summary. The tone, The bulkhead closure, the passive grid, the signal push, the mechanical override. Clean and factual, the way we had been trained to report. 12 cadets, no injuries, 11 minutes and change from seal to clearance. She was quiet for a moment. Then he said, to all 12 of us, the structural failure that triggered the seal was in an adjacent section. It has been contained. This was not a test. He said that last part clearly, making sure everyone heard it. Not a test. Real. One of the younger cadets, a Solith named Vela, who had been very quiet and very controlled the entire time, let out a long, slow breath. I heard several similar sounds from around the group. Oris said, Cadet Voss, my office at 1800. He turned and walked back toward the central section with the engineers. I watched him go. Vreth appeared at my shoulder. He looked in the same direction for a moment. Then he said, quietly, without any translator inflection getting in the way, because he had learned enough of the sounds that made up my language to do this now. Good, just that one word. In my language. From his mouth, unpracticed and slightly rough at the consonants, I said, thank you. We walked back with the group. 1800 came, and I went to Oris's office, and he told me two things. The first was that the full account of the incident would be filed with the Academy record and forwarded to Union Command. 12 cadets, sealed, power failure, opened a Type 4 bulkhead with a mechanical override tool that happened to be a 1,000-year-old blade. The file would go through channels and end up where it ended up. The second thing was this. He stood and took one of the items from the rack on his wall. It was a small disc, dark metal, about the size of my palm, with a marking on it that I recognized from our cultural protocol sessions. The Vale Kethvara distinction. The blade chooses its carrier acknowledgement. He had mentioned it in our conversation days ago, and I had not thought about it since in any concrete way, because I had not done anything at that point that seemed to merit it. He placed it on the desk in front of me. In the history of the Academy, he said, this has been awarded twice before. Both recipients were Vale. The distinction recognizes a warrior who has proven through action that the lineage of their blade lives in them, that the history is not merely carried but continued. He waited. I picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. Warm, the way metal gets warm when it has been held. In 2241, Oris said, Hanavas held a corridor for 11 hours, with a failing power supply and an old blade and 6 people who needed time. Tonight her granddaughter opened a sealed bulkhead with the same blade and moved 12 cadets through a real emergency, without a single injury. He paused. History, he said, has opinions. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, what do I do with this? Whatever you choose, he said. That is what the Kethvara means. The blade chose you. Now you choose what to do with the choosing. I went back to the barracks, that night carrying the disc and the sword, and a head full of things that were going to take a long time to settle into their right places. I sat on my bunk. I thought about Hannah Voss on a Sunday morning, running a cloth along steel, saying nothing, putting it back in its case. I thought about what she had left me with, not just the blade, the knowledge that you could do something hard and real and important and never once ask for credit, that the work was the point, that the corridor was the point, that the people on the other side of it were the point. But I also thought, they deserved to be named. I was going to find out who the other 5 were. The rest of the 14th Mobile Irregular Unit. The ones who had been in that corridor with Hana. The ones whose names were not in any official record because the politics of first contact had swallowed them whole. I was going to find those names, and I was going to do something with them that was worthy of what those names had done. I took Kuratori out of her leather wrap for the last time that night and hung her above my bunk. Not locked away, not stored. On the wall, where she could be seen. Vreth, across the barracks, looked at the change. She does not need to hide anymore, I said. Neither do I. He brought his limb tips together in the Keth gesture of respect. Around the barracks, slowly, a few of the others looked up and took in what was different. Desh nodded once. The Marath cadet at the far end of the row did something with his banded arms that I had not seen before, and that I looked up later. It was the Marath traditional acknowledgement for a comrade who had proven their weight. Kuratori caught the barrack light and held it in a long pale line, the same line she had always held, the same blade she had always been, older than my family name and sharper than any database had anticipated. They had called her a relic. They had laughed at her. Then they had gone quiet. Then a commander had bowed and an emergency had shown them why, and now she was on my wall in the open, exactly where she belonged. That is what I want people to understand about that blade, and about my grandmother, and about what humans do when you put us somewhere difficult and expect us to manage and nothing more. We do not just manage. We hold the corridor. We open the bulkhead. We bring everyone through. We do it with whatever we have, powered or not, recognized or not, named or not. And when it is over, we clean the blade, hang it on the wall, and get ready for whatever comes next. We are the relic. We survived everything meant to unmake us. And we are still here, still sharp, still flying, black crane flies.